Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
Will of the Wisp by BearLair64. Aloise's heart swelled with pride as she tramped towards the brook from which she and her family collected water each day. A cold, clear rill that flowed from the land that rose to the west of Brookside, from the big thicket forest. Her mother and grandmother had told her many tales of fantastic beings that dwelled under its forbidding branches and in the shadows that they cast. Today, though, the sun shone brightly and the air was warm with spring, and she had finally been allowed to retrieve a bucket of water on her own. She pulled along a small cart that she and her big brother Robbie had cobbled together. The clearing that led up to the trees that lined the winding stream was full of flitting birds, and their songs filled the air with sounds. Vari-colored feathers painted the meadow with a dazzling array of colors. Insects buzzed and chirruped and occasionally landed before her approach. The flowers clumped in multicolored arrays that gave off a clean, natural odor. It was a perfect day. There was no better way to describe it. Although she was very clever, at age 5, almost 6, she'd have exclaimed. She didn't possess the language to express it, yet her heart felt warm with the love for her home, her little place in the world. Shigao clung fiercely to the great horned owl as they raced towards the ford of trolls. The great bird was unhappy to have traveled in the bright light of day, but it couldn't be helped. Word had come that Trellings, smallest of the trollish folk, but much larger than his own people, had been seen at the fjord. This meant that they once more posed a threat to the Duanabiaga folk. The stream was the agreed-upon border between these enemies. The ford had been the meeting place for as long as they'd met, whether in war or to negotiate the intervals of peace between the natural enemies. In recent years, tall human folk had settled near the ford and frequented the area to obtain water. They were no direct threat, though they had strange practices when it came to cutting down trees, only to replace them with smaller plants. The benefit was that their presence mostly disturbed the Trellings, as it prevented them sneaking into the south side of the brook to raid the resources of others. The Duanabiaga lived more to the west, inside the big thicket, and on the south side of the waterway, on the opposite side from the tall folk. Shiogo, guided by the large predatory bird along the sparkling ribbon of the water that passed below them, there in broad daylight, a company of Trailings, 25 or better. They carried their long spears, and in lieu of their usual small round shields, they wore large rectangular models, slung over their hunched shoulders as they waded along the north bank towards the ford. The dun and black stripes of their furred bodies was best employed for camouflage at night, but worked well enough under the shadows of the trees, even in the bright spring sunlight. It appeared to be a war party, a large group by the standard of their species. Sunk in concentration, he almost lost his perch as his mount suddenly dipped and banked sharply to one side. The raucous sound of a shrieking crow shattered the air behind Shigao, and startled him so that he leaned low onto the back of the large raptor he rode. Another of the black feathered creatures swept past and attempted to grasp at him. Hard Grip, the great horned owl, pumped his wings to gain altitude as the Trellings looked up and pointed, then rasped out the foul language of their kind. However, their laughter was cut short when Hardgrip, snatched at the neck of one of the scavengers, and snapped its head from its body in mid-flight. With a small spray of blood, the crow and its head plunged to the ground, to crumple near its erstwhile allies. The Trelling's laughter turned to angry shouts and spear shaking. Shigao would have loved to attack them, but he was alone and needed to gather his forces. At that point, the rest of the murder of crows arrived, and he was overwhelmingly outnumbered. The chase was on, back to Grove Haven to warn his folk and raise their army for a counter-raid. If he could make it, they would defeat the Trellings and their crow scouts. If not, with no warning, the Trellings and their minions would strike, and the Duana Biega and their own animal allies would suffer. Eloise was in no hurry. She had asked if it was okay to watch some of the animals on the short trek, and her mother had told her it was fine, but not to dawdle too near the forest. She was afraid that Mother would send Robbie along, but so far he hadn't made an appearance. He was working with the other boys his age to drive away birds from the freshly planted fields. Grandma Sarah had a sore toe, so she would be at their 2-room cabin, likely making something tasty for their next meal. There wouldn't be much, but Eloise knew that her grandmother could cook whatever there was better than anyone. As she drew closer to the little brook, she noticed that it had become impossible to spy out any more birds. The insects had gone silent, and the small diurnal creatures that might normally stand and stare for just a moment failed to peek out from the depths of the trees at either side of the meadow. They'd become more cautious since they realized that many of the boys carried slings and were on constant lookout for small, furry, edible creatures. Yet several of the bolder types would usually show themselves to little Eloise. Even at such a young age, she had such a way of charming the animals and birds. However, today, it looked like she'd have to carry water without the company of any kind. She heard cawing of crows in the distance and some other odd noises. She didn't pay much attention. Nature was always busy with something. And those who lived in that particular forest were mysterious and often dangerous. Everybody said so. Hardgrip and Shigao made it nearly home before they had to once again engage in another aerial dogfight with the murder of crows that had followed them. That group had swollen to over 20 and would easily be able to take down the owl and his rider. Hardgrip was straining and obviously tired, yet he banked and pumped his wings to climb, preparing to fight as best he could. The members of the murder focused intently on their pursuit and did not note the squadron of raptors that launched from below and behind them. Shigao peered back over his shoulder to see the welcome sight that greeted him. He signaled Hardgrip, who turned his climb into a sudden dive. It took the crows by surprise for just a moment, and they swirled around one another as they adjusted their directions of travel. The momentary confusion and change of direction allowed the owls of the Duan Biega avianators to reach the altitude so that their riders could launch arrows towards the erstwhile attackers. The arrows were tipped with toxins that would kill their enemies very quickly. Crows were cunning, and the members of this murder quickly realized that they would not be able to win this battle without their ground troops to draw some of the squadron from the air fight. Several fell to arrows, and while all of the larger birds, mostly owls, made it through with only minor wounds, a few of the riders were less fortunate. Once the joining of the birds and the wee folk resolved into a short aerial engagement, Escal and Riquot, cousins, each received wounds, but then, as the murder seemed to scatter and retreat, they once more coalesced and swarmed over the eldest owl, Sharpbeak, and her rider. elder grain. The avian Aetors had swept away from the original fighting zone, each in pursuit of escaping enemies. When the remainder of the crows had turned as one to circle back and attack her, the sable-plumed carrion eaters were more nimble in flight than were the large birds, though much less powerful individually. Yet numbers told. The leader of the crows, a large specimen, took hold of Elder Grain's arm and the one in which she held the staff of her bow, and snapped and tugged her arm from her body. Blood splashed, and she shrieked in pain and rage. Yet she was a warrior of great repute and ability. With her last strength, she plunged the arrow that she had been preparing to shoot into the wing of the crow leader. Her mount banked away from the battle and headed toward the Grove Haven proper, the body of his small passenger already limp and spirit fled. The leader of the murder cawed to call his folk together, and they turned to head back to their own approaching forces. He began to miss beats with the wings that the Duane Biega had wounded, and presently plunged to earth, to die on the rocks beside the brook. Aloise had filled the bucket and now strained to get it into her small cart without splashing away too much of it. She felt a moment of triumph as the bottom of the now heavy vessel came to rest solidly on the floor of her cart. Mother and grandmother would be proud of her. Even Robbie might be nice for a little while. She was distracted by the cawing of a murder of crows that approached from upstream of the brook. Probably the ones I heard earlier, she thought a little absently. Crows are no danger, except in the fields. Robbie and the other boys would stop them if they went that way. They passed overhead, and their raucous cries sounded angry. She saw them settle just beyond the trees from her perspective. Then the shadows came alive with menacing figures of another kind. Monsters that for all the world looked like tailless raccoons, with blunt features that stood on their hind legs and brandished spears and javelins, and wore armor of leather and hard tree bark. They quickly surrounded the small human. She was tall compared to them, but they were well armed and strong. They averaged just above waist height on her, but between muscle and fur they bristled and menaced her and caused her to step behind her cart in fear. She saw that others moved in quickly to surround her. She had nowhere to run. The largest of them stalked up to her and chittered in a voice that was deeper than his size would have indicated. Eloise just stared in incomprehension. The being stomped his foot and shook his spear. He raised the flint point to her face and chittered loudly. She still had no idea what he wanted. And the sharp point scared her, yet it also made her angry. She knew that it was dangerous to put sharp objects near another person. With no other option, she batted aside the spear and said, "No! Don't you point that at me!" The trailing stepped back in astonishment. He was clearly unused to being disobeyed, much less defied. Another of his band approached and spoke to him in their language. "Chief Tanglefoot, I can speak some of their language of the, Umanish. Perhaps I can help. You wish her to come with us?" Tanglefoot looked at the feather-bedeckled shaman, still angry. "Yes, tell the thing to come with us if she has value to her people. Then maybe we can bargain for them to leave. Move to the side of the water with the riders. Let 'em take their land and trees." The shaman approached the young human and spoke as clearly as he was able. "You, human, girl, you, come." With the last, he waved Aloise to follow him. She hesitated, but then saw the big Trelling heft its spear and lower its eyebrows in very clear communication of menace. Grandma Sarah fretted over Alois. She knew that it was important to teach children self-sufficiency, but this close to the big thicket there was always danger. Those woods were haunted by all sorts of unsettling creatures and beings. Everybody said so. Her sore toe had her seated on the bench to do what work she was able, but if her granddaughter did not return soon, she would use her walking stick to hobble down to the creek to get her. Presently her grandson Robbie entered the little cabin. He looked annoyed. "Grandma, have you seen Alois? Ma told me to go find her and make sure she don't stray into the woods." This one could run no sore toes, she thought keenly. Chiago gathered with the others around the now lifeless body of Grain. She had been his mentor and his aunt, a close relative and leader of their clan, a fixture in his life. The Duane Biega wailed and keened in grief all around as he knelt and took her ravaged body in his arms. He led a procession to the great oak and carried her up along the hidden stairway that wound irregularly around the large trunk of the tree, and eventually to the platform hidden within the great fork. He laid her poor broken remains at the foot of the twin thrones of the king and queen. Queen Elias wept openly for her fierce aunt and knelt beside her, caressing her face and keening. King Lardit wept openly but quietly. He had dearly loved the old warrior, and she had trained him in his youth. "What has happened to our dear lady warrior, my brother-in-law?" Sheog looked up, and his tear-stained features morphed from grief to anger. "Trellings, my king, a large band, 25 or more, headed this way. Their crow scouts attacked and followed me. We drove them from our skies, but the war band approaches. I beg to lead our forces in the attack, to slaughter the enemy and drive them from our world." The queen rose and glanced at her brother before gazing in earnest at her husband. "We must go forth and strike them while they are still marching. We can take them from above, even with their crows, once they are under the crowded branches. Our squirrel riders can bombard them with stones and arrows and fire globes. When they flee into the open areas, our avianators can pummel them into submission. It is the way we have fought from time immemorial. We shall always triumph in the end." Liara thought carefully for a moment, his grief forgotten in the urgency of the moment. "I am concerned. The Trelling have not come in such great numbers for many years. Perhaps they have a new leader or a new plan. They are clever and mean." He raised a hand to stave off objections. "I know that their minds are no match for ours, nor are their crafting skills. Yet we must not make the mistake of underestimating us. They never come as far as the fjord without our scouts detecting them, and they have never attacked in daylight. Perhaps something more has changed." He gazed around the room, but no one answered. Eventually Shigao cleared his throat. "Perhaps they've learned from watching the human folk, the large ones on the other side of the water. They seem to move about exclusively during daylight. Strange creatures, everybody says so. In any case, we have very little time. We must gather our forces whether we attack or defend." The king and queen looked at one another for a moment, nodded as one, and then spoke as one. "Let it be done. Riders, to the feud." "So what do we do with the Omen thing while we are busy with the attack?" Tanglefoot asked the shaman and his senior advisors. The large being tripped along just behind them, flanked by a pair of guards. She attempted to speak, to ask questions, but even the shaman could barely understand her. Tanglefoot grew ever more angry by the moment. The shaman, White Ears, assured him that the creature was a small child. He was concerned that the parents might come looking for it. Such a being would be difficult to fight. This entire venture had been costly with little gain. Now the war band would have to take care of a giant child while attempting a surprise raid. White Ears offered, "Perhaps I could stay with the child during the battle, my chief." Tanglefoot eyed him askance. "You have other purposes. It is your job to attend those wounded by the poisoned arrows, to test the cure that you claim to have found. We cannot spare warriors to watch it. Perhaps we should just kill it and put it in the water. Surely something will eat it." Alois was frightened. She tried to tell these creatures that she wasn't allowed to go into the big thicket, that it was not safe. However, they could clearly not understand her. Maybe they just didn't want to listen. She knew that soon. Mother Burl or Grandma Sarah would get worried and come to look for her. How would they find her? She was tempted to cry, but she still felt some defiance. The two that had spoken at her previously now gathered with 3 others and chattered in their 2 deep voices as they waded along, ever deeper into the trees and other plants. They occasionally cast glances in her direction, so she knew that they spoke of her. She did not like the big one that had pointed its spear in her face. His countenance looked more wicked than the others, like some monster from a fairy tale. Then she heard a cry from behind. In the far distance, it was her brother Robbie. She drew in a breath and called back over her shoulder, "I'm here, Robbie. Come get me, the monsters." She let out breath in a whoof. One of the guards had used the butt of his spear to strike her in the tummy. Her eyes teared and she came close to bawling in earnest. But then she grew angry again as the little monster drew back for another strike, this time with the point. Her face flushed and she kicked the ugly being in the face. Then she turned and sprinted back the way they had come, calling out for her brother as she ran. The war band of the Duana Biega climbed aboard their various mounts and set out quickly above the meandering stream. They were able to move in an almost straight line that avoided the various twists and bends of the flowing water. Shigao led on a fresh owl, Fantail. She was lighter of frame than Hardgrip, but she was very fast and very fierce. She was young, but her nature would help her to defend against the crows. They made good time, and soon the scouts, the freshly bandaged Esquel and Resque, circled back to them and presently flanked him. Esquel gave the report. "Up ahead, not far, they will enter a grove of trees. About the time of our fur riders arrive. The crows spotted us and rose from the trees, but they settled back quickly. They seemed distracted." Shigao signaled that he understood, and then he used his horn to alert his band that they approached the enemy. Risco directed his avian down into the trees to pass on word to those who rode the large breed of squirrels that resided in the area and were happy to trade rides for food, shelter, and security. Then up ahead he spotted the Trellings. Odd. Why are they facing away from us? Unfortunately, one of them still paid attention, and with a hoarse cry alerted the others. The battle was soon fully engaged. Alois knew that the monsters would pursue her. She ran and dodged along the stream, but at the bend she chose to run straight ahead, straight back towards the shallow place where she'd gathered the water. She crossed the water over a fallen tree and sped onward, but soon the trees grew thicker and she had to turn. Then she encountered the roots of a forest giant that had toppled and left its now leafless corpse in her path. Before long, and before she knew it, she was headed in the wrong direction. The worst direction, back towards the Trellings. Tanglefoot yelled and tried to beat his troops into formation, but they were taken by surprise after all. The confusion when the Umanish child had run, Arrows, javelins, and stones rained down from above, and several of its warriors were already down, mostly with injuries, but two lay very still, in the way that only dead may achieve. His surprise daylight attack had turned on him, and his troops had been the ones to face the fury of the wee folk, the riders. Still, he was a forceful leader and an accomplished fighter. He soon had the warriors in order, and each interlocked and raised the shields they'd made from horn and hardwood. It had taken years to gather enough horn of the right type, but at the end of winter and the floods that came with it, they discovered the body of a large dead creature with enormous horns. It was enough to equip his entire force. Horn over hardwood would stop anything that the riders could fling at them. Even the little balls that contained flammable liquid could not melt the horn, and the sheathing on the shields would prevent the wood from catching fire and rendering the shields useless, or worse, a hazard for the bearer. He no longer cared about the Umanish child. That was a battle for another day. Perhaps her people would not even believe her when she told them what she'd seen. Better yet, something in the forest might eat her. He grinned briefly in malicious glee, then turned his attention back to the battle. Xiagao was shocked by the tight formation that the Trelligs presented and the effective shields, definitely different from the little round ones they typically carried. That would make things more difficult. They'd recovered from the surprise attack more quickly than past bands had done. It was that big one, clearly the chief. He'd gotten them in hand. It wouldn't do to have an effective leader in their ranks. He determined that he would take on the chief himself. Remove that one and the rest would fall. He urged Fantail to rise, then stooped towards the fearsome Trellig leader. The monstrously large figure came quickly into focus, and before the talons of the war owl could strike, the beast flung its javelin upward and braced itself behind its shield. The javelin struck true, and Fantail spread her wings to halt the plunge. She managed but just, but landed hard beyond and behind Tanglefoot. Xiagao quickly released his harness and ushered the large bird behind a stone. He saw that the wound was bad, but perhaps not fatal if he could get a healer on site quickly enough. That would mean quickly winning the battle. That would still mean taking out the Trellig chief, who had returned his attention to keeping his troops disciplined and focused on repelling the attacks of the Duani Biega. If they could hold off until fatigue sent the riders reeling, then they could press forward and attack the village proper. Xiagao made his mount as comfortable as possible, and then turned back towards the affray. He climbed up onto the stone and readied his bow, the mightiest of his clan, and prepared to loose an arrow on his nemesis. Aloise slowed when she heard odd noises from the area to her right. She decided that the noises sounded pretty much human, but very distant. She quickly headed in that direction. Shortly, she stumbled onto the oddest scene she'd encountered in her entire life. A battle in miniature raged just ahead of her. Tiny beings about the size of her dolly rode animals and attacked the monsters who'd held her captive. She stopped in her tracks to watch how it would unfold. The unpleasant one just stood behind the rest and stamped and roared at them. He did not notice her. As she turned, she felt a sharp stab in her hand, like the wasp that had stung her last summer. She couldn't help it. It hurt and surprised her. So she cried out, and the mean creature heard her. He turned, and when he saw her, he shook with fury, gripping his spear tightly, and ran at the little girl with murderous intent. With all of his rage focused on the child, he did not note the Duana Biega archer, who readied a fresh stab. Tanglefoot screeched out his fury and ran at Alois with murderous intent. The child was flustered and frantic with pain and fear. She turned about and looked for a place to run, but the monster, its fur standing on end and its features twisted with rage, menaced her with its spear and lunged towards her. She watched as a feathered shaft appeared to grow from its right eye. It fell forward and rolled to a stop at her feet, where it sprawled and laid still. She watched for only a moment and then began to grow dizzy and faint. She heard the clamor of arms and cries of anger, and the screams and moans of suffering and death from the nearby battle as her consciousness faded. As the long gray tunnel closed about her vision, and the sounds blended and roared in her ears, she swore she saw a tiny man, dressed in a kilt of feathers and leaves, approach and stare at her face. Silly, though. No one was that small, and they certainly didn't have green hair. "We have to get her back to her people," Shigao insisted. "They can best tend to her. She's big enough that the toxins may not be fatal." There were murmurs from around the moot circle, but not much enthusiasm. The clan had been damaged greatly in the battle. They had their own wounded and dead to care for, and a few prisoners to question and execute. They had no time for strange giant children. Let the child's own people care for her. "You and 3 others may," the queen, his eldest sister, began to speak, but was interrupted by terribly loud sounds of brush being trampled nearby, and the loud shouting in some strange language. Her features dissolved into a mask of horror. "Flee! Hide from the human folk!" Robbie stumbled into the small clearing and found his sister stretched out on the ground before him. She appeared to be in a deep sleep. She did not thrash, but he could tell by the look on her face that it was a troubled sleep. He tried to wake her, but was unable. So he ran to the nearby brook and dipped the bottom edge of his shirt into the water. He washed her face, and her features relaxed a little. He noted that her skin was very hot to the touch. Then he saw the mark on her hand. It was swollen and the skin was irritated. He feared that some venomous creature had stung or bitten her. He had to get her home, so he placed his hands under her arms and began to drag her back towards home. Eventually he reached a trail that ran along the stream and stopped to rest. He remembered their little cart. If he could get her into that, he could get her home quickly and with little effort. He hated to abandon her, but had little choice. He could also run all the way back to the village and get help. His thoughts raced. He leaned his young sister against the roots of a willow tree and hid her as best as he could in its arms, then fled back to where they normally filled their buckets. He did not notice the small figure that had haunted his trail and peered through the leaves as he pulled and tugged and sweated with his efforts. Shigao and his hastily selected band of rescuers watched in horror as even the bigger child fled and left the little girl alone and helpless in the big thicket. He set up the other 3 in a defensive perimeter and walked out boldly to check on the child. They had an antidote, but he wasn't sure it would work on a creature such as this. It might kill her since it was a counter poison. He used his knife to cut a small drain hole in her wound so that the poison and tainted blood could leak from her body. He fetched her some water in a large leaf. There was little else he could do. Then he heard more strange, loud noises. The day had been long and filled with oddities. "She's over here!" Robbie shouted over his shoulder to his mother and the other 4 people who had come along to help her search for her child. They soon had Alois in hand and started to carry her back to the cabin in the settlement. They discussed that maybe Grandma Sarah or one of the other wise elders could come up with some sort of cure. There was clearly a bite on the child's hand. One could see what looked like tiny teeth marks. Shigo sent out 2 of his party to follow the human folk back to their settlement. He and the last of the party headed home to gather some owls and what they hoped would be a cure for the little girl. When they arrived, there was another moot in progress. The entire remaining clan members surrounded the 3 prisoners they'd taken. They'd killed or seriously wounded a dozen of the trailing, then slaughtered those who were wounded, at least the ones that hadn't died from poisoning. Some of the others would likely succumb on their journey home. This was now a very personal feud. They'd lost 5 of their own outright, and possibly up to 7, based on the severity of the wounds suffered by 2 of their number. This was all in addition to losing Elder Grain in the initial skirmish. Many others had suffered less wounds, and several mounts had been killed or wounded. The Trollings had much which to answer. The 3 prisoners all had wounds. The one dressed in feathers and bone, clearly some sort of spiritual leader, was least injured. He was clearly the most intelligent, and they had grilled him with numerous questions, most of which he'd answered. It was possible that he lied, but there was no reason. The Trolling host was defeated. They'd lost more than half their numbers. The Duena Biega would counterstrike within days. More precisely, nights. They'd marshal every member of the clan who could ride and shoot or cast, and descend on the home of their hated enemy. They would slaughter every last one of them. Shigo arrived in time for the big question. Why? Why attack in this way and violate a treaty that had led to years of peace and stability? White Ears hung his head in abject defeat. He no longer feared for his life. He knew it was forfeit. There was nothing to salvage, and while he would answer the questions about the already failed raid, he would give no secrets to the defense of trailing home. He felt that answering what he could might buy him a swift and merciful death. There are a few reasons. Tanglefoot was a new chief. He wanted to prove himself, and felt that the treaties his uncle, Wartyface, had made did not apply to him. He decided on a daytime raid for surprise. He also had new horn shields that the tribe had gathered over the years for defense and maybe some other advantages. It seemed like a good time to raid. King Lairda stepped closer. You started to say that you had a cure. A cure for what? White Ears clutched his mouth shut and glared. He knew he'd made a mistake, but was determined to avoid saying more. Yet, as he thought about it, he decided that there was no real reason to hide the fact that he'd developed a surefire cure for the poisoned arrows and javelin points of the Duana Briega. The king of the wee folk was clearly growing frustrated and angry. I came up with a cure for your toxin. It's a counterpoison. I've tested it a few times on animals and twice on other trailing folk. In every case, it has worked. Though it was improper to do so, since the king had not stepped back. Shigao stepped up to the trailing shaman. From what is your cure made? The trailing blanched and looked at his feet, then shook his head. I will not tell you that. It will only allow you to make something worse. Shigao did not want to give away a state secret that might compromise the safety of his people. Yet the Trellings were defeated and would soon be wiped from this part of the big thicket, and the life of a child was at stake. We use a toxin based on the kickapoo plant. White Ears looked up slowly and thought for a moment. Then, with nothing to lose, he nodded. I used the same. Grandma Sarah and Mother Pearl sat on either side of the cot that held sweet Alois's burning little frame. She was racked with fever, and they knew that she would likely fade away in the early morning hours. They'd done all they could, and Mother Pearl wiped the child's face with a damp cloth. If only the fever would break, she half thought and half prayed. They hadn't had time for tears. Those would come later. Robbie sat silently near the cold hearth. He was terrified for his little sister. They fought some, but he genuinely loved her and wanted her to be safe. Yet he was helpless to do anything. Around midnight, Robbie started awake from a nightmare and looked around in the dark. They had 2 windows and a small window in the door. He thought he saw an odd light approach the window over Alois's cot. "Look," he whispered, shouted, and pointed towards the ever-brightening globe. His mother and grandmother both turned to see the luminous glowing ball that danced outside the window. Their mouths hung slack, and they made some sign for spiritual protection from evil beings. Yet the light was a cooling shade of blue, and once it steadied and reached the apex of its illumination, they could see it was nothing ill or awful. It hovered for a short time, then disappeared to one side. It soon shone through the other window, and then moved to the slot window in the door, then returned to the window above the sweet child's resting place. 3 times it made the circuit. Each time it hovered at Alois's window for a moment before it continued on its journey. After the 3rd pause, it flew directly away from the window and eventually winked out somewhere in the dark. There was a movement on the cot. A tiny hand reached up and rubbed its tiny eyes. Then a tiny voice murmured, "I'm so thirsty. I want my bucket of water." Chigao urged Hardgrip on home. His mission successful, the human folk child would recover. He had used the Wisp light to blind the larger beings and hide his presence. It was a handy tool for guiding large beings away from Grove Haven or sacred plants or sacred places. For some reason they were fascinated and would follow the lights without care, even into a swamp or the deep shadows of the big thicket, often to their doom. But this time he'd used it to save a life. And so ended the longest and strangest day of his life. So quoth this raven. My darlings, thank you to BearLair for sharing this with us. It was developed from a family story of his, which is quite interesting, and you can find that below the story on the subreddit if you want to know. Thank you so much for coming to my little chateau and visiting me. It means so much. It would mean so much more if you would subscribe and like the video. And please come again. I'll always have tea and cookies for you. And special thanks to my Patreon supporters: Ermin, Darren and Jennifer, Laura, Mutant Artificial Intelligence, Tabby Cat, Robert, and of course to Charlotte Emerson and Cortez Williams.